I'm going to switch gears again with this next segment of Survey 2 and come back to the idea of photography with a social conscience, kind of like Louis Hine and Jacob Riis, who were creating images to bring awareness to immigrants in our country and child labor laws. So I want to talk about the FSA, or the Farm Security Administration, which was part of a government project set up to document the challenges of rural poverty during our country's depression in the mid-1930s. The FSA had as its job overseeing and information gathering of farmers during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era at the same time. So under the auspices of a man named Roy Stryker, who decided to hire a bunch of young photographers, most of whom were no-name people, and send them off across the United States to document what was out there and what was happening during this time, and in so doing to form a visual documentary of American people in this struggle. Here's a photograph made by Dorothea Lange. It's called Migrant Mother, and it's certainly one of the most iconic images from that particular project. Here's a few more Dorothea Lange images from that period of time. And one of the things that's important to understand about these pictures is that they were completely intended to have an effect and an outcome, because that was Roy Stryker's agenda. It was to bring these pictures back to the financial and business capitals and to have people understand the plight that these farmers were in, to really make the country aware of a piece of the country that might not be seen otherwise. Also, the titles of these pictures are really meaningful. The one on the right is called Tractored Out, which really tells a specific story about the people and the situations of the American farmer during this particular time. So continuing on with more farm security photography, here is Walker Evans and Arthur Rothstein, who were both working with Roy Stryker as well. So these were highly publicized images, and the FSA was certainly a milestone in the history of the medium of photography. First of all, it was because it was the first time a government agency had set up this idea of going out and making photographs of something that mattered to them and bringing these photographs back in a sort of measured response to the situation at hand. So I guess if you ask, is it propaganda? It probably is. One critic, Glenway Westcott, who was an author writing about Walker Evans, said about his photographs, "It's because I enjoy looking that I go on looking, so that the pity and the shame are impressed upon me, and they are unforgettable." So the idea behind these pictures is really to change people's minds. And these rural people that they're photographing were oftentimes much more hard hit than the people from Wall Street who were jumping off of buildings, and they really didn't have much to lose. So next, I'm going to begin talking about some photography that was taking place since the 1950s. So the post-war world is a time when many things began to kind of percolate up. There's some major technical advances with speed and automation into the current time period of the digital revolution. So speed of materials. A general rule of thumb is that photographic materials since Niepce have sped up an order of 64 million times. Also, automation of our camera's processes have too. So now you don't even have to focus or adjust your exposure anymore. Or even of the picture being made, maybe the decisive moment doesn't even matter anymore, because new cameras, you have the ability to go back and edit a moment from a video. So you have lots to choose from. You didn't have to wait for a particular moment to actually snap the shutter. And now we have an even better understanding of photography's place. Because what began happening was that the big battle between, is photography art or is it commerce, ended up being, yes, it's both. It's art and it's commerce. Imagine trying to buy anything today without photographs. We're used to being able to see what something looks like by looking at an image of it, and since the 1950s, photography certainly has ascended as an art medium, and photography is in every major museum in the world at this point. So now I'm going to discuss some of the artists that have been making photographs since the 1950s. So after entering the second half of the century, we have this photographer, Minor White, who certainly had an impact on the field of photography. He is a photographer. He was also an educator. and he's combined many things into his understanding of the medium of photography. So Minor White is part of an American lineage of photographers. He was a student of Edward Steichen and Ansel Adams, and he also worked with Edward Weston. So here's an infrared photograph, this unusual type of film which is sensitive to a spectrum of light that we cannot see with our human eye, making this kind of surreal image. So Minor White understood the ideas of the F64 group and Ansel Adams' application of something called the zone system method, and which was how to accurately create a good exposure. It was a method of making exposures. He understood all of this, and he understood Eastern philosophy and mysticism, which here's something else to add into the mix. He was interested in Zen Buddhism and ideas about how we approach the world. So he took all of these F64 ideas and he combined them with Eastern philosophy to come up with ideas about photography that were more spiritual than they were photographic. One of his concepts is that until a viewer saw the photograph, there was no photograph. The photographer could make and finish a picture, but until he showed it to someone or she showed it to someone, there was no cycle of completing the essential essence of why it was even made. White believed that taking and examining photographs were spiritual acts. So Minor White was really tapping into the inner self in the making of photography, which was something very new for its time. Here's another photographer, Olivia Parker, who is working in the 1980s and who began making still life photographs. So this is something that photographers have not done much since the turn of the century, which is kind of fun and interesting. And she also began to make still life photography using an instant Polaroid camera. And one of the things that she found fascinating about the material that she was using was how it could change how it looked with temperature and by manipulating it as it developed in 60 seconds. So she could change many things about the photograph while they were processing themselves. So she called it having a darkroom in the palm of her hand, or the ability to change the way the color responds and how the material works. So she could manipulate the temperature, the length of the development time. She could apply pressure to the print as it was developing or scratch on the surface of it. And she could change the outcome of how the final image was going to look. So the 1980s were actually a heyday for the Polaroid Corporation, who had started in the later 1930s. But they were supporting a lot of artists during this time, and they actually had a lot of grants where they would give artists materials to just use the materials and make art out of it so that we can promote our product. So here's another artist, Joyce Namanis, who too was working with Polaroid material in the 1980s, and she was also creating collages of many images that come together to make one image. So in the early 1980s, as I was saying, there was a number of artists, including David Hockney and Joyce Namanis, who began experimenting with making large-scale images out of these smaller Polaroid SX70 prints. And much as the earliest photographers had composited large scenes from multiple negatives, like Oscar Rylander, Jerry Uelsman, Henry Peach Robinson, here's Joyce Namanis putting Polaroids together, to create a huge composite that ended up being one piece. In the early practice, much care was given to seamless registration of the images. Like Oscar Rylander probably was painstakingly putting together negatives to make one image. But in the 1980s revival here with this material, multiple perspectives and many angles came to be valued. Here's another artist who is appropriating imagery. His name is Robert Heineken, and he's also working in the 1980s creating photographs directly from magazine pages and advertisements. So this is the photographer that I shared with you guys on Flipgrid when we introduced ourselves to the class. So here's Heineken, and he's actually holding these pieces of magazine up to the light so that he can see through them. And when he finds something interesting, he uses a material called Cibachrome, which is a positive material to transfer what's on the magazine page directly onto the paper. So the images end up being exactly the same size as the magazine pages. Photo critic and contemporary author A.D. Coleman says, "Though the patina of these color photographs speak that generation, their revelations are contemporary in their incisiveness. And looking at the history of the photograph, beginning with Henry Fox Talbot's photogenic drawings, Heineken must be viewed as the most rebellious practitioner, unflinching, enigmatic, and alert. So contemporary artists, authors, and critics continue to draw from many of the artists of the past in processing ideas of the present, and Robert Heineken's work definitely influenced a new way of thinking about processing photographs and appropriating photographs from mainstream culture. So Heineken's work definitely influenced a new way of thinking about processing photographs and appropriating photographs from mainstream culture.